So welcome, everybody. My name is Julia Sast-Rubin, and I am a professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. And along with my fellow conference organizers and Rutgers colleagues, Charles Payne, Drew Gitomer, Saul Rubenstein, Michael Hayes, and Pengju Zhang, I would like to welcome all of you to the second session of the 2022 Education Policy, Communities, and Social Justice Research Conference. This is our 7th annual conference. In addition to today's session, there will be a session next Wednesday, 3:30 Eastern Time, on community schools and COVID, and then the following Wednesday, June 15th, on Newark and New Jersey, so really local. You'll get a reminder before each session since you've registered for this one. Today's session consists of 4 papers on the themes of school choice, privatization, organizing, and COVID. After all 4 papers are presented, we should have about half an hour for Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and I will call on you to ask, or if you prefer to have me read it, that's totally fine as well. So you can just say, I have a question, and put your name, or you can actually write out the question if you prefer that I ask it for you. Because there's so many people on the call, on the Zoom call, please mute yourself if you would, unless you're presenting. So with that, let me turn to our first paper, which is titled The Accelerated Push to Privatize, an Analysis of Trends in Private School Voucher Legislation Across the United States. The authors are Jessica Levin, Sharon Krengel and Nicole Ciullo of the Education Law Center of New Jersey, and Sam Boyd of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Jessica and Sharon will be presenting the paper today. Jessica is a senior attorney at ELC and the director of the Public Funds Public Schools campaign, which is a collaboration of the Education Law Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center to oppose private school voucher programs and ensure that public funds for education are used to maintain, support, and strengthen public schools. And Sharon is the policy and outreach director at the Education Law Center, where she oversees communications and legislative press partner and community outreach. She also works on the Public Funds Public Schools campaign. And with that, let me turn it over to Jessica and Sharon.
Okay, thanks very much. So good afternoon, everybody. We are very excited to be here to talk to you about public funds, public schools. Jessica and I work with the colleagues that you see also listed on this slide, our Education Law Center colleague, Nicole Ciullo, and our Southern Poverty Law Center, Sam Boyd, and numerous other folks from both Education Law Center and Southern Poverty Law Center work with us on public funds, public schools. So we're going to tell you a little bit about public funds, public schools as we work into our research. So on the next slide, you will see that Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the SPLC Action Fund came together to establish public funds, public schools, and as a national campaign to ensure public funds for education are used to maintain, support, and strengthen public schools and are not diverted for private education uses. We have been in existence for 4 years, and over that time, unfortunately, we've seen a noteworthy increase in legislation to create or expand private school voucher programs in the states. And to counteract that, PFPS works in various areas. We work in litigation, policy, advocacy, and research. We regularly engage with academics, organizations, and individuals around the country studying and fighting against school privatization. Next slide, please. So why do we oppose private school vouchers? We believe strongly that public education is a crucial public good that underpins our democracy, functions as the centerpiece of our communities, and brings together the disparate elements of our society so that everyone's common humanity can be known and can flourish. More specifically, there are documented harms associated with the privatization of public education through vouchers, and those include taking money out of public schools that in many states are underfunded, especially in low-income communities and communities of color. Vouchers also have a history of supporting white flight from public education and increasing student segregation. Students in voucher schools do not perform better academically, and in most states, voucher schools are permitted to discriminate against students, families, and teachers, including by refusing to accept students with disabilities, LGBTQ students, families, and educators. and any other student that they do not want to educate, unlike the public schools, which take all comers. Finally, voucher schools and voucher recipients are rarely held accountable in state voucher laws, and this leads to documented waste, fraud, and abuse. So briefly, we want to give you an overview of common private school vouchers. The first type of voucher is a conventional private school voucher, and what that does is pay for all or part of a student's private school tuition with direct payments from public funds. This obvious siphoning off of public money to pay for private education is widely opposed by voters. Many polls have shown that. And so over the years, privatization supporters have come up with workarounds, including the next two types of vouchers. So education savings account, or ESA vouchers, which are public funds deposited into a personal account that can be used to pay for private school tuition or other private education expenses. In most states, these vouchers are equivalent to a percentage of the state per pupil funding for the public school. Generally, these vouchers can be used to pay for tuition, as well as tutoring, online coursework, transportation, educational materials, and in many cases, often homeschooling. To work around the policy and legal objections to conventional vouchers, privatizers also came up with tax credit scholarship vouchers, which provide up to a 100% tax credit to individual taxpayers and to corporations that give the money they would otherwise owe in taxes to private scholarship granting organizations that then use this money to provide vouchers for private school tuition and other private education expenses. So the most important thing to know about all of these programs, regardless of what they're called, and there are other names as well, is that they result in public money leaving already underfunded public schools to subsidize private educational uses. And in many cases, these vouchers are being used by families that had already chosen private education and can afford to top off the voucher amount to pay for the additional private expenses incurred.
We want to briefly show you the voucher bill tracking tool that's available on the PFPS website, and there's the website there. The tool provides a range of information on proposed private school voucher legislation of all types across the 50 states and the US Congress. And as far as we know, this is the only publicly available tool tracking these bills nationwide, and it contains information on bills back to 2019. The tracker is interactive, so we've screenshotted a few examples here. You can search for bills by state, keyword, or by the tags, the category tags that we use. For example, you could search for ESA bills this year, or you could search for voucher bills in Arizona in 2022 or previous years. And when you click on a bill, you get a lot more information, as you can see on the right, including a public funds, public schools summary that we create if the bill has advanced to passing one legislative chamber. Over the years, we've refined a methodology for collecting and sharing this data. First, we identify all proposed voucher bills in state legislatures and Congress using a legislative tracking service, news alerts, and our advocacy networks. Then we classify the legislation using a long list of categories that you can access on the tracker. And we analyze the bills, and if they advance, as I said, we provide a full summary on the website. And then when the sessions are over for the year, we do a nationwide overview plus deep dives on key states and issues. Here are some of the things we look for in the bills. We look at various categories of information, such as the type of voucher, who's eligible, the size of the program, and how it's funded. And there are many common elements in these bills across the states, as well as individual twists, and this nationwide view helps us to recognize patterns as well as to spot emerging trends. 2021 saw, unfortunately, a turbocharged effort to propose and pass voucher legislation. In previous years, a small handful of voucher bills might be enacted in a few states scattered around the country. But in 2021, the map of states that passed voucher bills look like this, and we've highlighted in red the states that passed a voucher bill in 2021. So I'm not going to go through these lists, but we wanted to give you a sense of the range of voucher bills that passed last year. At least 7 states that are listed on the right enacted laws to establish new voucher programs, including ESAs, tax credit voucher programs, and hybrids of those two types. And then on the left, we have the at least 14 states which enacted laws to expand their existing voucher programs. And these can be quite significant as well through methods such as broadening eligibility criteria or raising program caps.
So we note several reasons why more private school voucher laws are being proposed and why more have recently passed in states around the country from 2019 through 2022. So the COVID pandemic and related school closures, remote learning, and mask mandates created an opening for privatizers to prey on parents' frustrations with their children's public schools. This is not to say that students and their families did not experience the uneven delivery of education during the pandemic, but right-wing forces and deep pockets made every effort to capitalize on that. And speaking of deep pockets, former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is not alone in providing significant sums to pro-voucher forces. It's enough to simply Google school privatization and dark money to understand the extent of that. Also, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue that state couldn't exclude religious schools from the tax credit voucher program it had implemented without violating the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. The court will rule on another case about public funding of religious schools this spring. There are now 23 states with a Republican trifecta, meaning governor and both houses of the legislature are majority Republican. In these states, public opinion in opposition to vouchers often can't overcome privatizers in positions of power. And finally, our research lifted up something new and insidious in 2021 and 2022. When a straight up voucher bill couldn't gain passage in the legislature, legislators and governors put voucher provisions in must pass legislation such as budget bills. But now for some good news. Polls often show strong support for public schools and majority opposition to private school vouchers. This is often because poll respondents and others strongly support their local public schools and see them not only as the best option for the education of local children, but also as an important hub for jobs and community building. Public school supporters also understand the importance of adequate funding for a high quality education. Many states do not provide adequate and equitable levels of school funding. So the notion of diverting money away from these schools for private uses makes an already bad situation worse. In some states, it's hard to pass voucher bills because Republican legislators representing rural areas without private schools know that vouchers won't benefit their constituents. And the proliferation of vouchers and other education privatization efforts has galvanized public school supporters who have launched strong advocacy campaigns to keep public money in public schools across the country.
Okay, that is some good news. Finally, we want to give you a sense of what our tracking is revealing about 2022. This data is preliminary because some legislative sessions haven't ended yet, and the data also hasn't gone through our year-end data cleanup process, but let me just share a bit with you. In 2022, we've continued to see numerous voucher bills proposed across the country, including for new voucher programs with very broad eligibility or large-scale expansions. Currently, PFPS is tracking about 200 bills from 2022. These are not all massive proposals to establish or expand voucher programs because we track bills, for example, that make modest changes to program requirements or that propose individual tax breaks for private education expenses. But still, there are a significant number of substantial voucher bills this year. For example, we have about 80 2022 bills marked as proposing a new voucher program and about 40 marked as proposing an expansion. Nonetheless, we're tracking markedly fewer bills than in 2021, about 200 right now compared to over 300 last year. Another concerning category that we started tracking back in 2020 is bills that are COVID related. For example, they might base eligibility for a voucher on a public school having mask mandates or being virtual due to the public health situation. And this year we're tracking about a dozen bills like that again. So some initial observations about the characteristics and fate of voucher bills in 2022. There were a number of proposals for universal or near universal programs. This year, we tracked about 20 voucher bills with no eligibility requirement or only a prior public school enrollment requirement, which could be a very low number of days. So voucher proponents are still using the strategy of getting their foot in the door with small programs or incrementally expanding them, but they're also going for a big bang. A few voucher bills have been signed into law already this year. For example, Alabama and South Dakota increased the caps on their tax credit voucher programs. Utah and Tennessee expanded eligibility for their vouchers for students with disabilities. But compared to 2021, again, there doesn't seem to be the same intensity of voucher bill enactment that you saw in that map with the red states. There were also some significant defeats of voucher bills this year, more good news, including in Republican-controlled states. In Utah, a universal ESA voucher proposal failed after the Republican governor had said that he would veto it because the state's public schools are still underfunded. In Georgia, an ESA voucher for any student in public school as little as 6 weeks failed, and that was in a bipartisan vote. And in Oklahoma, the Senate killed a bill that would have established a broad new ESA voucher program. So one final development we want to alert you to this year is a renewed attempt to use ballot measures to establish voucher programs. California's ballot campaign failed to get enough signatures. A Nevada court recently halted the signature effort there because it was misleading and omitted important information, and that litigation is now on appeal to the Nevada Supreme Court. And Michigan has a significant ballot campaign that we're closely watching, and I believe the deadline to get signatures there is today, so we'll see what happens there. But this all goes to show that privatizers' tactics are always evolving. We know that public school advocates must also evolve while remembering the lessons that have served us well in the past. So thank you very much for letting us share this research with you. And here's some info on how to follow our work. We welcome you to be in touch with us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really, really helpful data, sometimes very depressing, but still really helpful data. So, and some encouraging notes. So our second paper is titled School Diversity and the School Choice Ecosystem, a Mixed Methods Analysis of 5 School Choice Programs in Pennsylvania. The author is Sophia Seifert. Sophia is a PhD candidate at Temple University's College of Education and Human Development. Her mixed methods research focuses on how school choice policy is implemented and experienced in local communities. And she is a former middle and high school science teacher in Philadelphia. We have a few of those authors, former teacher authors on the panel today. So they speak from very personal experience. Okay, and Sophia, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Getting my slides up. All right, are we all set to go? Great. All right, well, thank you again for being here. My name is Sophia Seifert, as Julia said, and I'm a PhD candidate at Temple. And I'm sharing work that comes out of my dissertation research that really, if you think of it sort of coming off of Sharon and Jessica's paper, which is looking at the legal context, I'm trying to understand with public school choice options, how is that changing who goes to school together once these policies are sort of out in the wild? And again, I do that using mixed methods evidence from Pennsylvania. So first, a bit about the motivation for this study. As I'm sure most of you know, American public schools have been and continue to be segregated based on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, language, and a number of other characteristics. And while there is nothing inherently wrong with homogeneous schools, attending them tends to be a predictor of economic disadvantage, where the opposite tends to be true for attending a diverse school, as explained very eloquently in this quote. Now, many people have said maybe school choice could solve this problem because it breaks the link between residential segregation and school segregation. But from the beginning, there have been a lot of folks who are concerned that if the most advantaged families are the ones taking advantage of school choice and opting out of their neighborhood schools, it could really make segregation worse because it would be concentrating marginalized students in neighborhood schools. And what evidence shows is that especially the kind of contemporary voluntary public school choice programs out there tend to either exacerbate or just maintain existing levels of school choice, school segregation, excuse me. And how much that happens really depends on local policy and practice, perhaps not surprisingly. But existing studies that try to understand that relationship, they tend to only look at a single form of school choice when we know there's more and more of these policy levers out there, or they only look at principal decision makers and ignore how district level decision makers set that local ecosystem up. Or they only look at a single large urban district, the New Orleans and Detroits of the world, whereas we know school choice is becoming a characteristic feature of all different kinds of communities. So I'm going to try to fill in that gap a little bit by looking statewide across Pennsylvania at a variety of programs and focusing specifically on school district level decision makers. As I mentioned, this comes out of a larger study that's trying to sort of holistically look at this relationship, but I'm going to focus on two sub-questions today. First, I'm going to be looking quantitatively at how school choice is related to neighborhood school, racial and ethnic diversity. And then I'm going to follow that up by qualitatively looking at how district policy and practice might be shaping that relationship. Now, to get through both of these, I'm going to have to move quickly. So I'm sorry if I don't explain everything in detail, but I would be happy to answer questions about any of this during the discussion time. So to think about these questions, I draw on what's called a policy ecology framework, where we think about policies as part of complex embedded relationships. And the idea is if you analyze the different actors, the relationships between them, and the full complexity, you can identify strategic points for intervention. And that's why I take this sort of complex research design and think about lots of different actors. I also draw on an idea called diversity ideology. And that's because we can't assume that all numeric diversity is beneficial. We know that particularly students of color can face discrimination in diverse environments. And so it's really important to think about how are districts approaching diversity? Are they, as Mayorga Gallo explains in this quote, approaching diversity as a justice project? Or is it more of a sort of performative celebration of diversity? And what they describe as a diversity ideology, where you're like, yay, we're diverse, but they maintain existing systems of power and in some cases oppression that prioritize things like white comfort over, again, the like more liberatory promise of diverse learning environments. So as I mentioned, I'm drawing on data from Pennsylvania. Which importantly for this study has a really robust public school choice sector. I'm not looking at vouchers, I'm just looking at publicly run forms of school choice. And so in Pennsylvania, there are 5 primary ones. The most commonly known and most popular are brick and mortar charter schools. There are also cyber charter schools, which by some measures, even pre-COVID, Pennsylvania had the largest cyber sector in the country. And then there's 3 forms of public school choice. They're managed at the district level. Inter-district enrollment, where students can enroll in a public school, but it's not in the district where they live. Intra-district enrollment, where you stay within your residence district, but you don't go to your neighborhood school. Or magnet schools, which they could be inter or intra-district choice. They have some sort of specialty theme, maybe admissions criteria, and families opt into them. And these are very popular in Pennsylvania. And in all different kinds of communities, as you can see from this map. If you're not familiar with Pennsylvania geography, we've got Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which are certainly dark blue, but there's lots of communities where public choice is really heavily used. In 2017, there were 39 districts where more than 1 in 10 students opted out of their neighborhood school using one of these 5 programs. So Pennsylvania is a really informative state to learn about these patterns. To do so, again, I mentioned I'm using mixed methods evidence. And so what I'll be doing is starting with a quantitative phase to establish the broad patterns, following that up with a qualitative phase that hopefully can explain or expand upon what we saw in that quantitative data, and then looking across all of it to draw our conclusions. The quantitative data that I have, it's student level administrative data from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And it has the normal stuff, students' race and ethnicity, for example, but really importantly for me, for every student, it shows what their neighborhood school is based on where they live and where they actually go to school. And so that lets me classify them as participating in one of those 5 types of public school choice that I just discussed. I also draw in some other publicly available data to confirm things like urbanicity and school location. And all in all, my sample, it's 1.7 million K-12 students over 7 school years, 2011 to 2017. The analytic strategy I'll be looking at is to first look at the diversity of neighborhood public schools, where we know some kids have left to go to a choice school. Then once we've seen what that kind of baseline diversity is, I'll compare it to something called the neighborhood school counterfactual. And so this is an alternative reality where we imagine school choice is not available and everybody goes to their neighborhood schools. And so then I'll be able to compare these and see, are they different? Now, I'm not claiming these are causal. We know that school availability and school choice availability can change people's residence decisions, but this kind of strategy has been used a lot in research to suggest how geographic-based assignment systems compare to voluntary choice programs. My diversity measure is a relative measure of diversity. So I'm looking within districts, how much sorting is going on. How well does each school represent the community in which it's located? Because that's a thing that district level decision makers are more likely to be able to influence. And I calculate that using 5 racial ethnic groups as defined in the PDE data. Importantly, and I'll remind you of this when it's time, this is a segregation measure. So higher values mean more segregation, lower values mean less segregation. I'll be following that up with a comparative case study of 2 districts that'll be selected using my quantitative data. I draw on a bunch of different data sources as is typical in a case study. So a number of interviews with district and school leaders, publicly available documents, observations, and other publicly available data. Went through multiple rounds of coding to create memos, which I then compared for a cross-case analysis. So what did I find? The high-level headline is, perhaps unsurprisingly, school choice participation has grown statewide, and school choice appears that it's exacerbating neighborhood school segregation, specifically in urban and to a lesser degree rural schools. And that district-level practices, they can shape both the degree of segregating pressure that is put on neighborhood schools, and also the equity implications of diversity in a choice-rich environment where there's lots of choice options. So I'm going to go through each of these sort of big headlines one by one, just very briefly giving you an overview with the participation first. So as I said, participation, it did increase over the quantitative study period. This was really driven by big growth in brick and mortar charter school participation, which you can see from this yellow line as of 2017 was more than 5% of resident students. Now, this shouldn't imply that the other types of choice are not popular. If you were to add these up, there'd actually be more students participating in other forms of choice than charter schools. So while charter schools are the most popular, as many kids use other forms of choice as charter schools in Pennsylvania, and the overall number using them is increasing. So how does that relate to neighborhood school diversity? Here's where we get to that the segregation index I mentioned. So I'm going to walk you through this figure that does suggest that school choice exacerbates neighborhood school segregation in urban and rural schools. So here we have Thiel's H, that segregation index, where higher values mean more segregation and lower values are less. And the gray bar is what happens in neighborhood schools when some kids use school choice. And so if we look at urban high schools, for example, we see this high value of segregation, whereas in the black bar represents that neighborhood school counterfactual. We imagine nobody uses school choice. Everyone goes to their neighborhood school, and we see segregation is lower. This urban high schools was the largest magnitude difference, but they were also statistically different for urban K-8 schools and rural elementary schools. So this does give some credence to concerns of school choice critics about, especially in urban communities. So to try to understand why this happened, as I said, I looked for 2 school districts that could illustrate this change, or I'm sorry, illustrate this pattern. And so because we saw that big difference in urban high schools, I looked at urban communities and their high school diversity. And so I found what I'm just going to call District A and B for simplicity's sake. So District A is the typical case. It sort of matches that statewide pattern where school choice is exacerbating segregation. And it's increasing, segregation is actually increasing over time. District B, a really different pattern. We don't see that school choice is exacerbating segregation. There's actually higher segregation in that neighborhood school counterfactual here. So school choice may actually be helping diversity, and their neighborhood schools are getting more diverse over time, less segregation. So I wanted to look at those district practices and see how that might explain these divergent patterns. A little bit of context about these 2 communities. They're both mid-sized urban districts that are actually neighbors. They're in the same metropolitan area. They both serve predominantly economically disadvantaged students of color. And as is common in urban districts with that kind of population, they have below average state funding, though it isn't equal. District B has higher per pupil funding than District A. Both districts had, during the quantitative period, about 15% of their resident students participating in choice. So pretty high participation as of 2017. And importantly, both districts have had a small amount of white students declining as a share of enrolled students, but about the same magnitude. It declined by about 8 points in that quantitative period. Now, how did their decisions and understanding shape this relationship between school choice and school diversity? First, leaders in both districts understood school choice to be a racialized process. So in District A, where their school board was sort of divided over choice, like, do we like it, are we critics? Regardless of that, they agreed that opportunity gaps, as explained by this quote, are pushing students of color out of the district and into choice schools because they're seeking academic opportunities that they don't feel are available. And as this district administrator explains, their data backs it up, that there really were opportunity gaps, especially for Black and Hispanic students in District A. And so they think that's why they're participating in choice more. District B came to a different conclusion. They thought that individual residents' biases were driving white flight. They thought white and higher income residents were using school choice as an avoidance strategy to not go to school with students of color or students experiencing poverty. And their board and superintendent were united in being universally opposed to school choice. And all of those groups, this administrator that I quote here, but also the superintendent and school board, have publicly made similar statements that they see school choice as an avoidance strategy that's linked to folks' biases. So very different, but also racialized understandings. And these understandings shaped their responses. District A thought opportunity gaps were pushing people to participate, so they set out to address those opportunity gaps. They also thought that their families liked school choice, so they created in-district choice options. They established a non-selective magnet high school. District B really relied on market-based responses. They spent a lot of money to contract with firms to do a total rebranding and create a set of very glossy marketing materials, which they then tailored subtly to white and advantaged families. For example, by having sort of disproportionate numbers of images of white students and using more privileged distribution channels like universities and realtors to get these materials out into the community. They also really doubled down on neighborhood school recruitment, and were very savvy about this. They folded recruitment, for example, into early literacy initiatives so that they could move funds around that would both help their academic and recruitment goals. And so what we saw is that school choice leveled off in District B. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to go really fast now. Leveled off in District B, but increased in District A. And we saw that opportunity gaps here, we see overrepresentation of white students in AP classes declining in District A. They were starting to close those opportunity gaps, whereas opportunity gaps in District B were pretty stagnant. And so this shows us that the problem that these districts diagnosed is the one that they solved, but they didn't solve the other one, right? They only did one at a time. And that may explain why we saw these different patterns. District B was all in on neighborhood schools. That would improve relative measures of diversity like Teal's H, that is looking at how well does a school represent its community. So all in all, what I saw is school choice is growing and it may exacerbate school segregation, but that district leaders have agency in shaping both the degree of numeric diversity and the equity implications of diverse students' experiences in a choice-rich environment. And so we should be really thinking cognizantly about what are the ideologies these leaders are drawing on and what are their skills for navigating this really complex policy environment. So I will leave it there. Thank you all for your attention, and I'm eager to hear your feedback and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Really interesting paper. Really, this is really all great stuff. So let's move on to paper number 3, which is on opportunities for equity and reimagining education, reformer discourse during the COVID-19 crisis. The authors are Nora Reikosky and Laura Ogburn, and Nora is a joint education and political science PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research examines the impact and stakes of privatization and marketization in K-12 public education, particularly where private actors influence the expansion of workforce readiness efforts to educate students for future economic participation. Laura is also a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania at the Graduate School of Education, and her research interests include student involvement in education reform, how adult decision makers respond to youth advocacy, and ideas about whose expertise matters in conversations about education. And she is also a former kindergarten and pre-K teacher in West Philly and Atlanta. So let me turn it over to them.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. So as just noted, our paper is Opportunities for Equity and Reimagining Education, Reformer Discourse During COVID-19. And I'm going to just start by putting up a series of headlines that came up now over 2 years ago, which is sort of hard to believe, in March of 2020. So I'm just going to read through them quickly. So this one from the Blade: coronavirus provides opportunity for education. With pandemic, privatization advocates smell a big opportunity. Coronavirus school closures provide opportunity to rethink our education system, and on and on. So in observing these early responses by a variety of actors and news media outlets in the popular media during the more nascent parts of the COVID crisis, this phenomenon prompted us, Laura and I, to have a broader inquiry into this question: how are emergencies and crises engaged and leveraged by political actors to serve as policy windows through which pre-existing policy solutions are pushed? And in many ways, this really serves as the overarching discussion that we tackle in our paper, and we're just going to talk about a small part of it here. So I want to define a little bit more clearly what we mean in our case by political actors. So this context being the sudden and unprecedented school closure that, of course, all of us were in some way or another impacted by, that swept the nation. We are thinking about education reformers as a key part of this movement, both those in the private and in the public spheres. So we're thinking about policy and decision makers at each level of government, from the I would even argue from some of the street level bureaucrats in the form of teachers, district policymakers, and then those operating at the highest level, at the federal level, and then thinking about stakeholders, parents, teachers, and though they're frequently not included themselves in the discussions, students, of course. So this led us to a research question: how have reformers positioned their existing reform objectives in relation to COVID-19? And how did they frame, or how have they in an ongoing way framed COVID-19 as an opportunity to further those objectives? As we theorized the frames that we developed in this project, we drew on the recurring discursive themes that were captured in a review of documents, those that were made publicly available by major organizations, reform organizations, and others, and institutions in the education and education reform landscape, as well as data that we collected from several sources beginning in March 2020, news reports, opinion pieces, blog posts from popular news outlets, newsletters, and other documents from education organizations, as well as transcripts of speeches and press briefings that were made during this period by public officials and state leaders. Oops, there we go. So in developing our theoretical perspective, and in many ways this is a theoretical piece of scholarship, we drew on two existing strands of literature. And so these are the instruments that we use to evaluate the circumstances that we saw unfolding in the early part of 2020. So first is this idea of disasters as focusing events, those that open policy windows. And second, political actors and policy entrepreneurs that use diagnostic or problem-based framing and prognostic solutions-based frames in their framing of situations that are unfolding. We're going to discuss this framing a little bit more in depth in terms of the frames that we construct and identify. The second two sets of literature are the intellectual spaces and the conversations that we hope to contribute to and expand in many ways with the cases and the circumstances that we're exploring here. So first is failure and crisis rhetoric in education reform. And this is, I think, a theme in the presentations that came before, which is really a rich body of literature that notes the pervasive use of crisis and failure rhetoric in education reform, which we take as our starting place Nation at Risk report in 1983. The second is a much broader set of literatures in political science, particularly in political theory, that considers emergency politics and emergency thinking. And we're looking at this where this type of thinking, this type of policy undermines democratic processes in the name of decisionism or urgency.
So we're going to gloss over this case a little bit just in the interest of time, but just to note that a parallel historical example that many people here are probably already familiar with that tracks with the kind of thing we're talking about here is the case of charter advocates pushing for increased charter presence in New Orleans after Katrina. We use that as kind of a grounding historical example in our paper, and we're happy to talk about that a little more in the question and answer session if anyone's curious about how we're using that. In our paper, we're focusing primarily on two different strands of policy discourse that came up around the COVID-19 crisis. This is not an exhaustive list of what has happened or everything that could happen. These aren't the only terrains that have been contested, but they were each prevalent in conversations about education in the context of COVID. So the first area that we focus on is standards and accountability, characterized by an emphasis on standardized curriculum, high stakes testing, data-driven reforms. So in this area, some researchers and policymakers lamented the loss of data and wanted to find ways to conduct virtual testing to ensure that students weren't left behind. Others saw the pause on standardized testing as a reprieve from testing and a possible future to aim for, and advocated for rethinking the orientation around standards and assessments permanently. The second area we focus on is the issue of privatization, efforts to shift school governance, operation, public funding into the private sector and marketplace. One example that we'll talk about more a little bit later is Betsy DeVos's unsuccessful attempt to distribute CARES Act funding to private schools in a disproportionate way. In response to this effort, many actors called for decreased privatization and saw the possibility of emergency funding as an opportunity to instead reinvest in public education. We also saw a phenomenon that Nora has written about and calls pipeline philanthropy, where you see a flood of philanthropic action by corporations, much of which was time constrained so that it would convert into paid partnerships, which then translates into a proliferation of private actors in public education. So the discourse around each of these two central issues in our paper is comprised of these actors who argue for and against these two sets of reforms, each set of actors employing their own frames to convey their arguments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what framing is more generally, and then about two sets of frames that we've identified in this particular context, and how those two sets of frames map onto our focal areas of standards and accountability and privatization. So frames are interpretive schemata that assign meaning to experience and events and focus our attention. We use this language colloquially when we talk about framing an issue. In social movement literature, frames can be both ideologically and strategically motivated. People might frame an issue around their own beliefs about the nature of the problem or the best type of solution, but they also might be strategic about framing things in a way that will attract certain stakeholders. We also talk about both diagnostic and prognostic frames. Diagnostic frames describe the nature of the problem or diagnose the problem. Prognostic frames describe the nature of the solution or offer a prognosis. So in our paper, we identify and theorize two sets of frames that showed up over and over again as people were talking about education in the context of the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. The first of these two sets of frames is what we call equity framing. Equity framing comes across in both diagnostic and prognostic frames, both discussing the nature of the problem and possible solutions. So reformers and advocates frame the problems as being the result of a lack of equity in the education system, and solutions as having the potential to increase equity. Of course, not everyone means the same thing when they use language related to equity, which is something we talk about more in the paper. An example of a diagnostic frame that falls under what we're calling equity framing would be the notion that school closures will widen the existing equity gap in education. An example of a prognostic frame, the CARES Act funding for private schools will increase equity by ensuring that students are served regardless of what type of school they attend. So here equity is being framed in terms of whether a student goes to a public school, a private school, a charter school, et cetera. The second set of frames that we identified, we're calling reimagining framing. Reimagining framing is always prognostic. It's always describing a solution to some problem. The solution to the problem, whether it's the lack of equity, underfunding, or something else, is to reimagine, rethink, or rebuild the relevant parts of the system. So a couple examples here. DeVos's Rethink K-12 School Models grant under the CARES Act is framed as supporting models of remote learning not yet imagined. So here the implied problem is insufficient models of remote learning. We also have Amy Stewart Wells encouraging educators to reimagine the profession, including making the most of the reprieve from standardized testing. The implied problem here being some issue with standardized testing. Reimagining is, of course, linked with the notion of reform, but it's also distinct. Something is being presented as new or fresh, different, exciting. The opportunity for a new version of something is part and parcel of this framing. So what we ask is, how do these framings support the efforts of policy entrepreneurs to expedite their preferred policy solutions in response to the emergency or crisis caused by COVID-19? And I'm going to pass it back to Nora, who's going to look more closely at how some of these frames played out in one specific example.
Right, and I think we're going to move kind of fast through this. But one of the ways that we explore both this equity and reimagining framing is through cases. And particularly in our paper, we look at the case of the CARES Act. And we look at two elements here. First, the attempted allocation of funds to private schools through the Department of Education by then Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. And then second, through the language and the specifications surrounding two competitive federal grants. So on March 27th, and I'm just going to go really quick through this, Congress allocated $16.5 billion in grants and funding to states. 3 days later, I'm a little out of order here, but a month later, Betsy DeVos's department issued non-binding guidance on the disbursement of these emergency federal relief funds for, in their terms, equitable purposes. And this was followed later by binding guidance in July of 2020 that required the local education agencies to distribute funds to all students in their jurisdiction, both those in private and, importantly, to public and to non-public, i.e. private schools. This guidance really worked to fully actualize a key reform platform of DeVos and her administration to systematically distribute public funds to private schools, which of course the first panel tackled very elegantly. Ultimately, these efforts, which hinged on a novel interpretation of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was struck down in September by a federal judge. But it really illustrates for us this arc of an attempt to use this emergency moment to push through a platform that was well underway many years prior. Second, going a little bit out of order, 3 days prior to the disbursement of that initial guidance on April 27th, DeVos unveiled two competitive discretionary grants, which, as Laura noted, were named the Rethink K-12 School Models Grant, and second, the Reimagining Workforce Preparation Grant, which was targeted towards short-term post-secondary programs. I'm going to put the text of this press release up on the screen because it, I think, neatly packages our two frames together here. So as DeVos says, if our ability to educate is limited to what takes place in any given physical building, we are never going to meet the unique needs of every student. This is an implicit equity frame. She goes on to say, the current disruption to the normal model is reaffirming something I have said for years. Here is her ongoing policy perspective. We must rethink education to better match the realities of the 21st century. This is the time for local education leaders to unleash their creativity and ingenuity, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do to provide education freedom and economic opportunity for America's students. Ironically or otherwise, no mention of COVID here whatsoever, even though this is coming as part of the CARES Act. So we think that this framing has opportunities for future work, and we hope to have developed a framework that's portable to future historical moments of crisis and emergency, which are likely inevitable, but to reevaluate how it is that policy reformers and particularly policy entrepreneurs are responding to emergency-oriented policy making. And this is in part the work of our project. And then I'll leave these up here, but our hope is that we can use this as a frame for thinking through empirical moments as they arise. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really interesting work. Such great papers. So our last paper, hopefully Rhiannon is still able, she was telling me that there were storms going on in Canada where she is, so hopefully this will hold on for the next 15 minutes, is on fighting on the front lines, intersectional organizing in educators' social justice unions during COVID-19. Excuse me, the author is Rhiannon Maton, who is an assistant professor in the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department in the School of Education at SUNY Cortland. Her research focuses on how educators and schools can better support students facing systemic social and economic marginalization, including through union organizing and grassroots mobilization. And I just want to remind everybody that I noticed that there have been a few questions already put in the chat, which is fantastic, but do feel free to please place any questions you have in the chat, or if you just want me to call on you and ask it live, put your name in there or message me directly, because as soon as Rhiannon finishes her paper presentation, we will turn to the discussion and the Q&A. Okay, and with that, let me turn it over to Rhiannon. Rhiannon, you are muted. I don't know if that's intentional. Uh-oh, I'm not sure she's hearing us.
Okay, sorry about that. I didn't
great.
realize I was muted, and then Keynote makes it really difficult to navigate. Okay.
You're good now. Okay,
Sorry.
great.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So again, thank you, Julia, for the introduction. So I'm Rhiannon Maton, and the talk that I am giving today is based on a paper that I recently published in Gender Work and Organization Journal, and I put a link to that paper in the chat. So the paper is titled "Fighting on the Frontlines: Intersectional Organizing in Educators, Social Justice Unions During COVID-19." So there has been a recent upsurge in the number of US educators unions employing social justice unionist principles. Such principles are visible in efforts to explicitly embrace assertive tactics while organizing for traditional worker compensation issues alongside common good social issues. Such unions, also called social justice unions, have grown immensely in numbers and media visibility since approximately 2010, yet they grapple with how to achieve continued growth given the propensity of the US media and policy circles to portray unions in a negative light. One rhetorical and practical method embraced by such unions has been to employ the phrase, students' learning conditions are teachers' working conditions, which implicitly allies education workers with local communities. While this phrase is often repeated by rank and file educators and their unions nationwide, social justice unionists often appear to struggle to explain how exactly working and learning conditions are intertwined. Perhaps crucially embedded within this difficulty is the persistent perceived division in education workers from public school students and their families and communities. Yet, education workers and public school students are largely composed of identity-based groups that have experienced historical challenges in the US and elsewhere to secure full rights and freedom from discrimination. So for example, 76% of public school teachers nationwide are women, and more than 50% of public school students are racial minorities and or qualify for free and reduced price lunch. So teachers and their students share in common that they are from the working class, and that around 51% of public school students are also gendered similarly to their teachers. As Mark Stern and Amy Brown point out, teachers' work is women's work, and thus it seems necessary for educator unions to more clearly articulate the relationship between educators, students, and local communities in a common effort to improve working and learning conditions while strengthening the public sphere. So in response to these calls and conundrums, this article examines how social justice educator unions situate the role of identity in their organizing work and how they mobilize the working conditions are learning conditions argument. In so doing, I pay particular attention to union organizing during the 2020-2021 school year of the COVID-19 pandemic. This study draws upon interview and artifactual data that was collected within 4 unions that embrace social justice unionist principles and approaches. And those are the Boston Teachers Union, Chicago Teachers Union, Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, and the United Teachers Los Angeles, along with news media and political reports from local, state, and national sources. So first I'll talk about gender and working conditions. Behind the scenes in their interviews, social justice unionists, educators, and union leaders discussed how gender impacted their working conditions during COVID-19. Participants' discussions of gender frequently centered on the emotional and physical toll of long hours during COVID-19 spent juggling home responsibilities with work-related responsibilities. Mitty Jenkins, who's an educator in Chicago, reported, "I think that a lot of teachers that are parents, the responsibility most of the time falls on them to educate the children and make sure they're doing everything. So you're at home with your kids because they're not at school, but you're also on the computer trying to teach other kids." In a later interview with Jenkins, she situated women educators' experiences during COVID-19 within broader political decisions and dynamics. She said, "I feel like it's an attack because it's a profession full of women. So the very things that you should be understanding about because we're women and we have children and we most of the time are the caregivers for the children, and society and the district don't seem to care about that. They're just like, you need to go to work." Jenkins points to the crisis nature of the pandemic and the ways in which women who are frequently positioned as the primary caregiver for their children, even while in coupled relationships, were forced to bear the burden of childcare, even as their employer forced educators back to work. She points out that the employer lacked empathy or sufficient accommodations for such dynamics, despite the fact that more than 3/4 of US educators are women. Now, discussion among social justice unionists of COVID-19's gendered toll often overlapped with media documentation of the pandemic's effect on women workers through highlighting the high workloads associated with the pandemic on women workers and their challenges in juggling such demands with responsibilities such as child rearing, elder care, and housework in the domestic sphere. The discussion points to the poor treatment of educators during COVID-19 as situated within an historical patriarchal system of values that undermines women-dominated caring professions, including educators. Members and leaders of social justice unions frequently discuss the relationship between student learning conditions and race and class dynamics. For example, Joel Richards, who is a teacher and member of BTU, our Boston Teachers Union, describes what inequities rooted in funding disparities along race and class lines look like in his district. He said, "It's normal for kids to go to school that are non-ventilated, that are dirty, that don't have suitable bathrooms. It's normal for a Boston school teacher to work in that. I'm in the South End neighborhood. There are $1 million condos all around. The city will tell us that they don't have enough money, so don't tell me that you don't have the funding." Rather than redistributing tax funds that were gleaned from pricey real estate to public services, governments in many cities, and this includes Boston, Philadelphia, and others, have instead tended to lower tax rates for the wealthy while continuing to underfund higher need public schools. Thus, Richards points to the ways in which local and state tax funds from the wealthy in Boston fail to be mobilized in ways that benefit schools serving students from lower income and racialized backgrounds. Now, meanwhile, educators' social justice unions push back on the assumption that under-resourced schools in economically insecure and racialized neighborhoods are morally justified. Jennifer Johnson of the Chicago Teachers Union explains, our analysis is that the reason our school system is underfunded and under-resourced is because these students are mostly Black and brown and poor, and our political systems don't value full investment. In explicitly pointing to the role of race and class in determining the funding directed to public schools serving children from racially and economically marginalized backgrounds, Johnson and other social justice unionists highlight the systemic manifestations of race and class-based oppression, linking student, family, and community social class and racial demographics to the systemic material conditions of schooling serves a rhetorical function that aligns educator unions with local communities. Now, social justice unions frequently employ and situate their work around the tagline phrase, students' learning conditions are teachers' working conditions. Implicitly, this phrase gestures at educators' understanding that students and educators share in common their physical location, and that the learning and labor of each group is dependent upon the material resources allotted to this location. Also implicitly messaged is the idea that students in specific cities or geographic locations, whether that's Chicago or otherwise, are not receiving the resources, facilities, nor services that they should. Thus, the phrase contains a practical call to action, meaning to improve the material conditions of schools, alongside a moral call to action, which is because students and others deserve a high quality and resourced public education. Boston school nurse Rosemary Connors applies a social justice unionist focus on under-resourced schools to examine district response to COVID-19. She points out that the district's reopening plans echoed its general disregard for systemically marginalized students. She reported, and the Boston Teacher Union's motto is to fight for the schools students deserve. And nothing has been so glaring as the reopening plans. And just to see how different buildings are so inadequate and how that ties directly into who we're serving this expendable population. So here Connors links the union's focus on organizing for common good issues with the ongoing policy treatment of economically and racially marginalized students as expendable. She points out that COVID-19 exacerbated and made increasingly visible the longstanding failures of the school system to provide material resources and services to particular populations of students. Educators' social justice unions see workers and students as interconnected through their shared experience of the chronic material under-resourcing of schools and public services during and beyond COVID-19. And yet, while educators' social justice unions tend to clearly articulate the effects of inferior material conditions of schools on the learning experiences of students and the working conditions of educators, they tend to struggle to clearly point to the ways in which the identities of educator workers and students are bound together in a common experience of systemic marginalization due to broader power relations. Thus, in conclusion, the problem facing public education is usually discussed publicly by social justice unions as an issue of inequitable learning conditions that is bound up in students' race or class identities, and sometimes both. And meanwhile, it's privately discussed by unions as being an issue of working conditions that's tied to workers' gender and sometimes their racial identities. The linkages across such categories of systemic oppression are not always made explicit for the public nor union members and leaders. I argue that social justice union discussion of working and learning conditions would benefit from being grounded in a clearer overarching systemic frame of analysis that accommodates and incorporates intersectional issues while articulating the fundamental linkages across gender, race, and class inequity. Bound up in working and learning conditions are, of course, workers and students, and the varied yet commonly subjugated identities that they tend to hold across race, class, gender, and other identities. The most consistent and visible tie binding school workers with those whom they serve is their common economic standing and their shared desire for a stronger and better resourced public school system. Power building and success in achieving material gains will be most likely when people bond together across identity groups in resistance to and protest of the broader system at play. Ultimately, the movement will most benefit when tight internal bonds across identity groups can support a coordinated movement to dismantle inequitable power, wealth, and resource accumulation for the few at the expense of the many. Key to this approach is clearly pointing to a common cause for such harm and inequity. And I draw upon the work of Angela Davis, Nancy Fraser, and David McNally, and you can read my full paper to see my analysis of these scholars, to propose that unions point to advanced neoliberalism as the ultimate culprit, as this term draws attention to the pain caused by financialized capitalism through the mass upward redistribution of wealth, alongside the stealthy use of identity-based rhetoric to secure the endorsement of self-declared progressives. By clearly articulating the harm reaped by advanced neoliberalism upon schools and families, and the families, students, and communities that they serve, and the linkages between student learning conditions with the working conditions of educators, unions may experience enhanced success in allying with the public and winning popular support for their organizing efforts to enhance the funding, resources, and respect accorded to public schools, and particularly for those schools serving populations who are BIPOC and or facing economic insecurity. In other words, rather than pitting workers against students, families, and communities, as traditional union politics have often done, I believe that through clearly articulating the linkages across the varied and often identity-based experiences of these disparate groups, social justice unions may thus be empowered to ally these historically divergent groups in opposition to a common adversary, and through this enhance their ability to claim and assert power within and beyond the era of COVID-19. Thank you very much.